On stream, I've been talking a fair bit about how I'm currently concentrating on improving my Chinese to the point where I'd feel confident offering it to clients as a language I translate, and I've touched a bit on how I'm going about that. In this video, I'm going to go into more detail on my method and try to use it as sort of a springboard to talk about the concept of comprehensible input and what comprehensible actually means. The first thing I should note is that I'm not starting from scratch with Chinese. Over the years, I've made a number of attempts to teach myself the language. I also took a semester of it at university, ages ago. I have a good general understanding of how the sentence structure works, a lot of more common Chinese-specific vocabulary, and can generally understand about 60 to 80% of what I read in Chinese as long as it's on a subject I have at least some knowledge of. I'm also a Japanese speaker, and as such I know several thousand Chinese characters. That's all the Chinese characters one needs in Japan to get through primary and secondary education. Quite a few characters I've picked up from reading novels and other literature and other things, plus a large number of more specialized characters that one needs to read medical and technical texts. Being a Japanese speaker is definitely a plus when it comes to learning a language that requires one to learn a large number of Chinese characters, like, say, Chinese. A lot of characters have roughly the same or related meanings in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Indeed, there are quite a lot of words consisting of two or more characters that are identical in all three languages. For example, the word for society, in Japanese, shakai, in Korean, sahe, in Chinese, 社会. It's the same word, it's just pronounced differently. And interestingly, the pronunciations are quite similar. Indeed, there are these shifts in pronunciation between Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese, and they follow predictable patterns, but that's a topic for another video. Apart from that, if you're familiar with the meanings of large numbers of individual characters, you can often make a fairly reliable, educated guess as to their meaning when you find them arranged in different ways, as will often happen if you're a Japanese speaker learning Chinese. But here's the thing. Knowing what the characters mean doesn't mean you know how to say them out loud, and the characters themselves on their own don't offer a whole lot of help on that score. At most, there are phonetic elements that might give you an indication about the vowels and consonants involved, but not the tone, and tone matters rather a lot in Chinese, being a tonal language. So I've had to make a few modifications to my normal way of learning a language in order to make it work with Chinese. In particular, I've added a bit where I write down characters whose readings I don't know, together with their pinyin, the phonetic transcription, as a way to learn the pronunciation and tone. It's all rather painstaking, but I'm finding so far that the number of characters per page that I can read aloud with relative confidence is steadily increasing, so there's that. Normally, over the past 30-odd years, I've had a pretty straightforward way of getting my feet wet in a new language. I pick a book or two from my favorite series, Colloquial or Teach Yourself, Complete. They're basically the same thing. Complete seems to be the new name for the series that used to be called Teach Yourself, in order to gain an overview of the most important features of the language, and then I seek out a translated edition of John Grisham's The Firm or The Rainmaker, or, say, Stephen King's Misery or The Shining in my target language. But wait, doesn't this seem like rather advanced reading in a language that, after all, I've only just started learning? Wouldn't it make more sense for me to read something easier at first, like practice dialogues or little paragraphs about the shopping lists of fictional people who only exist in order to provide examples of grammar and usage? In a word, no. The problem with these sorts of materials is that they're boring, and for the most part, the language they teach is not particularly smashing either. Target language materials written specifically to teach foreign learners the language are rarely what I'd call scintillating. And the thing about boring materials is that being boring, in and of itself, makes them less suitable as language learning materials. What we know from research, and what I already knew from decades of personal experience, is that language learning materials are only helpful if they can actually draw us in enough that we're really interested in what's going on. That's how implicit learning can happen. If you're having to force yourself to pay attention, you're probably not learning much of anything. Books like The Firm, The Rainmaker, The Client, The Shining, and Misery, on the other hand, are books I've read hundreds of times, specifically because I really like them, and find new things in them every time I reread them. None of them have any difficulty holding my interest. Plus, since I've read them hundreds of times, I basically know them off by heart. Now, I couldn't recite them without prompting or anything like that, but if I read one paragraph from one of those books, I can pretty reliably tell you what's about to happen, what the character is about to say, and things like that. The result of that is that, with relatively little prompting and some fairly basic vocab, I can follow the translated edition pretty well, whilst my brain focuses on how things are being said in my target language. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about comprehensible input. The Firm in Chinese is input. It's stuff written or spoken in the target language that a learner, me, is exposing herself to. But what about the comprehensible part? The thing to remember about the comprehensible in comprehensible input is that it's not some inherent property of the input. The same input that might be comprehensible to me may not be comprehensible to somebody else. The same input that might not be comprehensible to a person at one point might become comprehensible to them later. Comprehensibility is at least as much about what you bring to a text as it is about what a text brings to you. Fundamentally, it's about whether you have points of reference that allow your brain's language acquisition device, as researchers call it, to begin parsing the input, taking it apart, looking under the bonnet, and understanding the meaning and how the meaning's constructed. It's the difference between, say, a page full of words you don't know and can't begin to make sense of, and a page full of words you've never seen before, interspersed with words that you are familiar with. Or say a page full of words you've never seen before, illustrated with pictures that help you work out what at least some of those words probably mean. Every point of reference gives your brain more basis to break input down into manageable bits and pieces and analyze what it's looking at. If you learn the meanings of a few words that are used in the text, those words will give your brain more information that allows it to make sense of the remaining words. If you're told that some of the words are actually people's names, then that simplifies the process further, because you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to make sense out of the meaning of them, which I should note in Chinese, for example, is a really significant thing, because the names it can potentially look exactly like words if you don't actually know the difference, if you're not familiar with the names and things like that, because it's just 3 character combinations, and plenty of words are that. If you're told in advance what's going on in the text and the names of the characters, your brain uses that information to deduce how the words on the page, or whatever they are, could be a video or something, relate to the story. Different people work best with different types of points of reference, different ways of priming the whole acquisition process that starts with comprehensible input, but this basic process will always be present. So let's have a look at it, using the example of my learning Chinese from a translated edition of John Grisham's The Firm, or Xian Jin. First, what am I bringing to the text? Well, I know the names of the characters, and I practically know the story off by heart. I know several thousand Chinese characters and can make an educated guess about pronunciation, except for tones. I have a basic knowledge of how Chinese sentences function, where modifiers go, what characters break up phrases. Let's visualize these things by looking at a fairly typical page from the book. First, here's the page as it actually looks. Next, the main phrase breaks, sh, de, zai, de, are highlighted in red. Knowing that phrases generally begin or end with these 4 characters, and many others as well, the input becomes more manageable, since we only have to parse what's going on in front of or behind these phrase breaks, as I'm calling them, rather than having a whole long sentence or paragraph to puzzle out. Now, to show how this looks when our priming includes knowledge of pronouns and the like, in addition to these phrase breaks, we highlight the pronouns, both personal pronouns like I, me, him, her, they, and demonstratives like j, na, na, that indicate this, that, and which in purple. So now we have discrete phrases in which we at least know where he, she, this, that, they, them, etc. occur. To the extent that we already know what's going on in the story right now, because I do, our language acquisition device now knows that the actual heavy lifting is being done by words other than these. Next, we highlight the proper nouns, place names, character names, and the like in green. If we know that these characters are just phonetic renderings of names like Avery, Mitch, Texas, El Paso, etc., then our language acquisition device can look for the words that describe the action elsewhere. Gradually, our discrete phrases are beginning to be populated with known quantities. The more known quantities we have, the easier it is for the language acquisition device to get on with the parsing that will eventually result in us having a reliable instinct for how the language functions that allows us to understand it and to produce it. Now finally, we highlight all the words that are either known or familiar as a result of already knowing Japanese in pink. Now the only words that remain in the original black are the ones I can't immediately interpret with confidence, either as the result of prior knowledge of Chinese or overlapping knowledge from Japanese. Now, just to be clear, I don't go around screenshotting every page of this book, putting them into GIMP, and then using the fill tool to color code characters according to the scheme I just described. Apart from everything else, just doing this one page was enough of a pain in the ass. The point of these visuals is to illustrate the process that our brain's language acquisition device goes through when faced with a mix of known, possibly known, and unknown target language input, how those reference points are identified and used both to try to derive meaning from the rest and to make sense out of the way in which the information is presented in the target language. So, how's it working out for me? In terms of simple reading comprehension, quite well. As the visual aids demonstrate, I'm dealing with a relatively low percentage of truly unknown material. Even some of those characters that remained in black, I can be fairly certain are classifiers, counters, or things like that. For people who aren't familiar with Chinese, classifiers and counters are quite important. Every noun has one attached to it. And often when you say a thing, the way you say that is the specific classifier and then thing, like run. Run is person, and g is the classifier that is just sort of a general purpose one. And if you know that that's often what's in the spot immediately before the noun, then you can just, that already simplifies your process of understanding. Now, this is all just passive knowledge, to be sure, but we should never dismiss passive knowledge of a target language. That's where everything starts. If you don't have passive knowledge, a mental account of the target language, how it sounds, how it organizes phrases, etc., you haven't got a basis to develop active knowledge. And with some languages, say Chinese, acquiring even passive knowledge is not easy, since you have to memorize an extremely rich and complex ideographic writing system and develop awareness and understanding of the system of tones. Plus, as a translator, I deal mostly with the written word, talkings for interpreters. So solid reading knowledge, roughly on the same level as my knowledge of Japanese, Korean, Russian, or any of my other working languages, would already be enough to start offering my services as a translator of Chinese into English, Spanish, and German. But what about the pronunciation issue? How's that working out? It's early doors, to be sure, but I'm finding that the exercise of writing down the characters together with the pinyin every time I find a word I can't readily pronounce seems to be improving my ability to recall the pronunciations of the characters, including the tone. I'm certainly finding that there are increasingly large sections I can read without writing anything down, because I already know all the readings of the characters in them. I have to say, it's also not doing my handwriting any harm.